Okay, my carefully laid plans for this evening have been waylaid by a case of the Mondays, which means my computer's not working. Well, it's more that OBS isn't working because I went to get the screen recording ready for the replays I had prepared for this video, and for whatever godforsaken reason, it's just not working. But I value my schedule, so I decided rather than spend however long fighting it, that is a problem for tomorrow. Because I still wanted to make this video and I was not going to let this stop it. So that's a problem for tomorrow because I've been working hard today and I want to reward myself with a movie and then still get to bed on time so I can get a good night's sleep and then wake up in the morning and be productive early and not feel tired. You know, it's good for your health or something. What a responsible movie watcher I've turned out to be. In my earlier years of cinephilia, I'd be like, "Oh, it's only 12:30. I can start a movie now. It's only 2 hours." And now I'm like, So yeah, I am not going to let my ancient piece of junk computer stop me from enjoying whatever I watch. I've got a couple of new titles on my list, but if I can't decide, which is a very real problem, by the way, then my backup is a rewatch of The Battle of Algiers, which is amazing. And I have two other films by this director I want to watch, Capo and Burn. And so I figured it would probably be a good time to dig this out now in the near future. So yeah, I decided to add a little bit of visual stimulation to this. Then we would hang up the Christmas lights that we actually used for part of my movie when we shot it here last December. And rather than the extremely harsh lights of this, old Eastern European apartment, yeah, usually I don't have them there, but who knows? I might keep them. I mean, I'm moving in a couple of weeks anyway, but yeah. And my favorite album ever, Funhouse, is back there. And most importantly, I decided, and I am well aware that this verges way too close to having a script. I felt dirty while doing it. But while I was, having dinner and deciding how I was going to fix this problem, I decided, you know what, just write it down. So this is our version of the showdown replay that's usually on the screen in these kinds of videos. And yeah, so this video is about 1 versus 2 layers of toxic spikes. Now, you might have seen my video about whether it's better to have, 2 layers or 3 layers of toxic spikes, because the new modern good player wisdom, which is already becoming conventional, is that if you cannot get the 3rd layer of spikes, don't go for the 2nd. Because, yes, more damage is good, obviously, but the general idea is the 2nd layer of spikes is not enough of an upgrade from the 1st. So whatever you're going to try to do with that 2nd layer of spikes, obviously there are going to be cases where you do want it, of course, but let's say you have a Skarmory, you might generally be better off on the turn you're going to get that 2nd spike, go for a Whirlwind instead, rack up more damage that way. If you're not going to be able to get the 3rd spike on whatever switches in after. So go for a Whirlwind, go for a double switch, get an offensive threat in and pressure the opponent that way. It generally contributes to a more direct form of progress than that 2nd layer, should you not be able to get the 3rd. So this is not exactly the same thing with toxic spikes, obviously, because sometimes you want the 1 layer because regular poison is better than toxic poison for your specific purposes. But the general idea that carries over is the same. That idea being that you want to maximize the turn, maximize the progress you make on that turn where you could get the 2nd layer. So, with Skarmory, do I go for the 2nd layer spikes or do I Whirlwind? With something like Toxapex or, Roserade or whatever, in whatever tier you're playing, it's less, do I go for the 2nd layer of toxic spikes on this turn? And it's more, do I go for the 2nd layer of toxic spikes at all? So, yeah, spikes and T-spikes are also different in this sense because you can heal off spikes. Something like Leftovers Metagross in Advance is very well known because, yes, it is Spikes weak, but because it is so resilient and it heals in sand, then it takes Spikes damage and it heals it off in a couple turns. Swampert is another great example. With Toxic Spikes, that's the main difference. That's why you would use T-Spikes over Spikes, even on a fast-paced offensive team. You would say, well, why wouldn't I just use Spikes then if I'm trying to wear things down more quickly? Isn't the whole point of Toxic Spikes that you wear things down, slowly? And it's like, yes, kind of, but generally it's more that the opponent can't heal it off. Like in the Metagross or Swampert example we just gave. So yeah, you've got that kind of pressure. And more so, it also gives you opportunities in a one-on-one where you'll see this a lot in DPP on Toxic Spikes offenses, where you'll have a Pokemon with Sub or sometimes Protect, and that extra turn of chip damage is what you need to put something away. And obviously, Spikes can put something into range just as much. But when you are being ransacked by hazards, the idea is switch less, do damage more. And so sometimes you can get around being weak to spikes if you make the most out of every turn. And you're getting a lot of damage in, you're making progress. And with T-Spikes, it can just be as simple as, well, you've got this big threat, but I click Protect and now you're in range. So it can be different. And that very idea of making the most out of the turns is very much part of what we're going to get to later. So here's the general principle. Fast games, one layer of T-Spikes. So fast games actually means most games, because the way you're going to want T-Spikes to be played is you want them to act as quickly as possible, meaning you want the more immediate damage. So this does not just mean offense team, versus offense team even. It can be offense versus stall, of course, even though obviously there are exceptions and we will get to them. But you might also say, well, what about, bulky team versus bulky team? Yeah, that's the most obvious example of where you would want the second layer of T-Spikes. But even then, it's all about considering the fact that regular poison does a lot more immediate damage. And if you are constantly making things switch in and out of battle, then you don't have enough time for the bad poison to set in and start out damaging things. Yes, in a one-on-one, then you will outstall a Toxic Blissey way, way, way more easily than you would a regular Poison Blissey. I mean, there's a reason why Venusaur doesn't use Poison Powder. I don't know what other toxic or poison move Toxapex uses. Baneful Bunker, actually, but you're not using Baneful Bunker with the express purpose of spreading poison as you would Toxic or T-Spikes. But yeah, Baneful Bunker Toxapex is very good. But the point of this is, this is actually kind of helpful, just so I don't go all over the place. Don't worry, I have a scheduled tangent in a couple pages, just in case you thought I was selling out too much. Yeah, so it's all about maximizing those turns. Yeah, bulky teams, moving quickly. So it's we even have the math, right here on the second page. But if you want a concrete example of how good regular poison can be, you don't even have to look to one turn of T-Spikes. You can look to GSC, because in GSC, a toxic Pokemon that switches out, when it comes back in, it's regular poison. And it's a little different in GSC because you take the regular poison damage as you switch in. So a common strategy is you force something in that takes spikes, takes poison, and it's 25%, so it's basically a super effective Stealth Rock hit. And then, most traditionally, you roar it out with Raikou. And so you're basically getting super effective Stealth Rock hits on things. But you also see how much more pressure you immediately put on something taking 12.5%. So 6.25, I mean, that's just canceling leftovers. So if you are playing a faster paced game, then you are generally going to want that one layer. And and most of the time you are going to be playing faster paced games. That's why, this note here says this is most games, even / especially with bulky teams. Just because you are playing with a bulkier team does not mean you're not going to want to play more aggressively. Even stall teams, very famously across the generations, the scariest stall teams are the ones that play most aggressively. They're not trying to stall you out and, take you to 600 turns until you lose your mind. They're trying to choke you out as quickly as possible. Close that window you have to break through their teams. It's all about maximizing those turns, which is the exact principle we're talking about here. So when you're using T-Spikes, you're usually pairing it with things that try to buy turns, Sub and Protect. So that's why you want to really consider that 1 versus 2 layers thing, the fast acting versus the slow acting. So yes, the basic idea for why the second layer of T-Spikes is something you actually want to avoid is that it takes more time to pressure the big threats. So we are getting to that. So each turn is crucial, and this is just rehashing what I already said, so I'm glad I don't need to resort to too much reading. Jesus Christ. They might beat you before they're in range of your attacks. So that is the idea. And the example I'm specifically going to draw on later is something like a CB tar, where it is hitting you really hard. You're probably not going to be able to wall it too well. So but you've toxic it or poisoned it. So it's on a timer. It's that you want that timer to be faster. But a lot of times with the T-spikes, you are not going to just switch around everything until it faints from poison damage, reliably. If you're going to do that reliably, then it doesn't matter if it's regular poisoned or toxic poisoned. In these cases, you're more likely going to just need to finish something off as quickly as possible. You want it to drop into range for your revenge killer as quickly as possible. And in those cases, you want the poison to be more fast acting. So, okay, so my other note here is just you get more value, which is what we said earlier. You get more value on that turn, the turn of the would-be second layer, than the second layer, more directly. So that whole principle, you say, oh, could I go for the second layer of toxic spikes with Toxapex or Roserade or whatever? You could also say, you know what, maybe I should Scald, maybe I should Knock Off, maybe I should double switch to a threat. Same idea. Except here it's even more overt than in the spikes example, because at least spikes is always, second layer of spikes, even if it's not proportionally as good as something else you might have done, it's still going to be doing more spikes damage, which is really good, of course. Whereas with the second layer of T-spikes, you might actually counteract what you're trying to do. So here are the percentages. And you might be familiar with these if you are, I hope you can see it. I didn't really have time to do a camera test. But you might be familiar with these figures if you use a lot of Flame Orb Pokemon or Status or a Toxic Orb Pokemon. Obviously, in newer gens, when Flame Orb is 6.25% per turn, then it's always better, right? But in earlier gens, pre-Gen 7, then you would actually run Flame Orb you would run Toxic Orb even though it did more damage over time than Flame Orb. So let's look to DPP-UU for an example, because that's the tier I'm probably most familiar with in terms of Status Orb users. And there you would have things like Swellow, most notably. And it's all about, oh, well, Toxic Spikes, you can get Protect stalled, okay? But then you realize, look, this thing is not staying on the field for very long. And in the time that you are on the field, you want to take as little damage as possible. So you would much rather the gradual accumulation of Toxic rather than Burn, which is, for our purposes here, Flame Orb is regular poison. So, if it was just, regular Poison Orb versus Toxic Orb, then you would still take Toxic Orb. Because, look, so turn 1, regular poison is doing 12.5%. It's doing that every turn. So let's just take this over the course of the first 3 turns. Because if you're dealing with an immediate big threat, if something's not an immediate big threat, then it doesn't matter as much because you are not in mortal danger against it. So let's say the CB tar that destroys your entire team, you do not need as much damage on it as possible and as short an amount of time as possible. And you are going to try and fish for more of those with Protect and Sub, but there's only so much you can do with that. You can't double Protect, you can't always create a substitute or more than one substitute. So you want more fast-acting damage against these big threats. The second layer of T-spikes is for those slower games, and we'll get to that. But yeah, so 12.5, 25, 37.5. This is the total damage. And that's with toxic poison. Regular poison. So that's racking up very quickly. So, and you can consider this Flame Orb for your Status Orb poke. But yeah, with Toxic, then you are doing 6.25, then plus 12.5. So after 2 turns, you have done 18.75%, as opposed to the 25% over 2 turns. And then on the 3rd turn, you have done the same amount of damage with both forms of poison, or a pre-Gen 7 burn. And it's only on the 4th turn that toxic damage out-damages regular poison, which obviously, if you're going for longer games, then yes, you want that. But if you are setting that first layer of T-spikes, then you are wanting that immediate damage. And what I was trying to not trip on my words to say is that it also, in terms of getting that second layer of T-spikes, If you're playing this faster paced game where you want to limit the opposing threats as much as possible, you are not limiting them as much with the second layer, number one. And number two, you could be limiting those threats by creating progress elsewhere. So rather than second layer of T-Spikes with a Roserade, let's say, then go for a Leaf Storm, just as a stupid example. Or double switch to something, cut off their threat level more directly. So that same fast-paced playstyle, which you want with that one layer, whether you are facing a fast-paced team or a bulkier team, it's all the same. So, notice the difference in percentages for these first couple turns. You were doing 6.25% more on the first turn. And one turn is already one of the biggest things in Pokemon. And 6.25%, that is a lot. So, and then on the second turn, you are still out damaging it by a significant amount. Also 6.25 if my math is not horrible. Yeah. So you are doing 6.25% more over 2 turns. So on each turn, on both turns for the first 2 turns. And then, on that third turn, then yes, you have done the same amount of damage. But earlier you spent only 1 turn getting to that point. So 37.5% after 2 layers of setup is not nearly as efficient as 37.5% after 1 layer of setup, to say nothing of the opportunities that you are going to get from the more immediate damage of 12.5 and then 25. And then once you get past that 4th turn, but if you're dealing with a big threat, like let's say again CB-Tar, then you are not going to have the luxury of sitting on it for more than 2 or 3 turns. And this is where the example I drew up came in. Because if you have more turns than that against it, then this is not a hard and fast rule, but you are generally going to be okay. So I hope you can see this okay. I literally tried to draw a showdown replay. Not well, but hopefully you can see it okay. So here's turn 20, because I figure that's a decent number. Then Toxapex, which has taken some damage, as you can see from the HP bar here. I hope you can anyway. I can't see what's on the camera right now because the phone is facing the other direction. Because if I have the camera flipped so I can see myself, then it reverses what's on the page, and we don't want that. So bear with me here. Toxapex has taken some damage, and you're facing a CB-Tar that has taken Stealth Rock damage and is poisoned, right? So and here we have Finchinator loves Big Stall because it's very important, and then Blunder, CTC, and CBB are all screaming offense in unison. Anyway, so Toxapex is flanked in the rear by a special attacking Revenge Killer that needs help with T-Tar. This is very famously the case over multiple generations. T-Spike's teams are loaded with special attackers. Special attackers don't do as well against T-Tar. And T-Tar is one of their biggest T-Spike's targets. So if you're using a Raikou team in DPP, for example, then you want T-Tar worn down. And T-Spike's does that. This is why I'm a big fan of Protect Raikou, because you can have that one-on-one against Tar, and you can just grab that extra 12.5 on it very immediately. And that's really big, because let's say T-Tar came in after a KO, and if you just had spikes, then it's going to sit at that percent no matter what. But with T-Spikes, then you have the opportunity to go for more damage against it. Or if you have something like a sub-protect Heatran, then you could just sub and protect repeatedly and beat things one-on-one that, with just spikes damage would be absolutely impossible. I've had sub-protect Heatran just completely solo, Swamperts from high health because it was regular poisoned. Yeah, that's the example here. So you've got this Revenge Killer, call it like a Tapu Lele with just Moonblast, or, some sort of Greninja. I don't know. Whatever example you want to use. Specs Dragapult with Draco Meteor, that's probably more accurate. So it depends on what else you have defensively. But let's just say, for the sake of it here, you've got a pretty physically defensive Toxapex, and you can take a Crunch, you can take a Stone Edge, but you can't stall it out forever. You cannot recover Toxic Stall this. You are certainly not lasting 4 turns against this T-Tar. Absolutely not. Whether you're recovering once and switching out, whether you're spamming recover until it takes Toxapex out, whatever it is, you do not have 4 turns to get up to the 62.5% mark. You want as much damage as possible in as short an amount of time as possible. And so rather than go for that longer, slower burn, slower toxic, I should say, then you want the more immediate option of, look, bam, 12.5, bam, 25. Let's say it KOs your Toxapex on the second turn. You have done 6.25% more to it than you would have with the second layer of T-Spikes. And hopefully, if we have been following the same principle, then hopefully that extra turn you could have spent the second layer, setting up the second layer of Toxic Spikes, you will have used more efficiently to create more progress in another way. And if you didn't have time for that second layer of Toxic Spikes, then by definition, you were doing something more useful. So you see how it relates. And yeah, a lot of the time, you know, second layer of T-Spikes is almost a luxury, and sometimes a luxury you shouldn't even indulge in. Anyway, so yeah, whether it KOs you immediately, because that percent on Toxapex actually looks pretty vulnerable to Stone Edge, and let's just assume whatever switches in can't really take it either. So something is getting sacrificed, but then you revenge kill it with your Dragapult or whatever, and you're fine. So you want that immediate damage, whether it's one turn, whether it's 2 turns. And yet, even if you do somehow last these 3 turns, you are doing the same amount of damage to this T-Tar, 37.5, and bringing it down to 50 from the 87.5 it starts at with Stealth Rock. Then you are doing that more efficiently because it only took you 1 turn to set up the conditions for it to reach 50% after 3 turns, as opposed to the 2 layers, which do the exact same thing. And, you know, the 4 turns are just not happening. So I hope that made sense. And now we will move on to the second layer of Toxic Spikes. But before we do, I promised a segue or a tangent, and this is just the word box, because I think box is really funny as slang for vagina. I don't remember what decade it was popular from. I think it was like an 80s thing. But yeah, I told my lady about it just because I am on a never-ending quest to be as silly as possible. And she thought it was so funny, and it's become a very silly in-joke. And I was so proud of how far I've indoctrinated her, because she's not American. She had never heard of this rather obscure form of slang. So then we went to see Dune a couple months ago in the theater. And when Léa Seydoux says to Austin Butler, you know, put your right hand in the box, she fucking lost it. And I was so proud. I didn't even say anything. It was great. So anyway, here is the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. I love this book, just so you can also think I'm intellectual while also laughing at the word box. Anyway, the second layer. So obviously in longer games, this is what you want, right? You know, in that in longer games, again, it's not necessarily stall versus stall. Let me get my second layer with Toxapex. But it also means in longer games in terms of what you're stalling out. If you've got a special attacker taking on Blissey, like a sub Calm Mind Suicune or Jirachi, let's say, or a sub Protect Heatran, let's say, that's a much better example. Because at least the sub Calm Minders are boosting, and they're going to overwhelm it more easily if Blissey can't heal with lefties, or at least cancel out Sand, or you get my point. But with Sub Protect Heatran, it's only strength against Blissey is stalling it out. So in such a case, then yes, you do want that second layer. But that is not always advisable. So even if you've got, you know, a bulky team against a bulky team, to get back to that earlier point, you really want to make sure that you wouldn't be better off number one, using the turn for a second layer. Why not double switch to, made up example, Tornadus Therian and get a knockoff off? You know, wouldn't it be better to do that? And number two, even if you can get that second layer rather safely and you don't see much more direct progress, think about how you're going to use that poison you inflict on the opponent. Are you going to force them out immediately every time? Like, let's say you want to catch a Slowbro with Toxic Spikes, right? So what's your switch into the Slowbro? Is your switch into the Slowbro threatening it out every single time immediately? You know, in that case, you are going to do more damage with the first couple of turns. You know, if it's not lasting on the field for 4 more turns, then you are probably better off with 1 layer of T-Spikes for the reasons we mentioned. Also, you got to be able to function with 1, and this is a case that specifically pertains to Gen 5 OU. You don't see it as much now, but it used to be when Tentacruel used to use Toxic Spikes in black and white. It was like its only moveset. And then, you know, Sub started getting popular and other things. But the idea is, okay, well, 2 layers of Toxic Spikes and you will not be stalled out by Jellicent anymore. Well, what happens when Jellicent switches in as you set up the second layer of T-Spikes And obviously, there's more nuance to that because, Jellicent wants to switch in immediately. So you T-spike as it switches in, and then you T-spike again as it, burns you or whatever, which is also not good. But let's just say, and then you switch out and you force it out, and then it'll be badly poisoned when it comes back in. But if they set it up so that Jellicent only steps on that first layer of T-spikes, you cannot do anything about it. And you will have to contend with a regular poison Jellicent. And when you do that, then your whole plan of stalling it out just goes out the window. So you will have to contend with that. And then here's just the bulk versus bulk thing again, chasing things out quickly. So yeah, and looking for a situation like sub-users versus Chansey and Blissey. So that was basically it. So yeah, even if you've got, though, obviously this is a game by game basis, and I'm sure there are, all sorts of high-level tour games where a player went for a second layer of T-spikes and the best players wouldn't agree on whether it was better or not. Oh, well, it was more optimal to do it this way or that way, or, stall it out with Tapu Koko roosting as the poison accumulated, whatever. This makes me think of a Gen 7 OU SPL game where EO had a protect Tapu Koko alongside T-spikes. And in a situation like that, you are not stalling out entire things with it. You want that immediate... I can only snap with my left hand, by the way. I kind of can with my right hand, but not as well. I don't know why. And in that instance, I didn't even snap with my left hand. But you want that immediate damage with the poison. And if you're protecting for offense, if you're protecting because you're going to try and stall entire things out, then yeah, okay, maybe. And again, there is nuance to this. I'm not even saying that you shouldn't necessarily want that second layer against faster paced offense teams if your strategy is something like subbing and protecting nonstop. Like Philip 7086's famous Team of Torment from DPP, that would famously go for the T-spikes first to limit CB tar so it was more easily stalled out. And you could really lean into that strategy with the second layer, depending on how you were going to use it. But yeah, that is basically it. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this alternate style of video, and I will see you in the next one.